Hey everybody, I have a video here for you today. Now, I hinted at this one in my last video. Atlantis has been the topic of a lot of conversation lately. There has been a lot of theories out there, and most of those theories use Plato as a guide to try to find it, and I just think it's kind of a lesson in futility. Plato's part fable, where does truth end and fiction start? So I have never really attempted to say, hey, this is Atlantis, and how can you even say that with a straight face? This is for sure Atlantis. Well, I think that is kind of laughable. I have had requests, and I have stated before, I like mysteries that are really hard, that you really have to think about. So, okay, today we're going to give it a shot, not through the words of Plato, but through the monuments on the Giza plateau, some ancient text, Ignatius Donnelly, some work of Danny Wilten, and I'm just going to try to tie a lot of loose strings together. But the Egyptians, did they come from Atlantis? Well, it's not called Atlantis in their ancient text, but the story matches Plato's. Now, I have never gone in search of Atlantis, and this is just something that has been slowly adding up piece by piece to me in order to make this video. I don't like to go out on the crazy train a lot. I like my videos to be based on evidence, ancient texts, some stuff that we can say is tangible. Atlantis, well, I'm going to give it my best shot today. And the best way, I've said this before, the best way to solve a mystery isn't to dive right in and try to find an answer. It's just to study everything you can know about a certain thing and then let the answer just present itself, and when it does, you'll know it. Now, I haven't gone in search of any answers about Atlantis through the Egyptians, but stuff is just kind of presenting itself when I'm looking into other stuff, and I can't ignore it. So I'm going to talk about it today. This is just a slight possibility, but a possibility based on some real evidence and stuff that isn't out of the realm of possibility. But the monument we call the Sphinx today, it has a lot of very ancient names. The Lord of Terror is one of them. It was the guardian of the necropolis. Whatever this was in its original form, I think it was Anubis. It was meant to scare people away from the sacred site. And everybody is concentrating on what he is looking at on the spring equinox in the horizon. But I think we're missing something just as important. But the Sphinx by the Egyptians is called Horiketi, the Horus of the two horizons. Horus was the god of the rising and setting sun. So that says the rising and setting sun were just as important. Everybody's concentrating on what he is facing due east, the rising sun on the spring equinox. Well, the setting sun on the spring equinox would be just as important. But Horiketi was just a simple way of saying that this monument tracked the sun from the time it rose in the east till it set in the west. But the hieroglyphic symbol here for Horiketi, man, when I saw this, my memory went back to a few years ago. But here is the hieroglyph for Horiketi. And when I saw this, my mind went back about 3 years ago to a video I made about a symbol that appears to be on part of the main structure of the Great Pyramid. In the few years since, I have come to get a kind of a grasp of them, and especially the ancient and oldest and important ones. This just seemed to be an aspect of the god. It tracked the sun from sunrise to sunset. And this here is the Akhet symbol, hieroglyph, and that is one of the most ancient and most important in Egypt. Now here is the entrance to the Great Pyramid where they hacked away some stones. And actually, I think this might have been where they found their way out. But I have said that we don't have any hieroglyphs at all in the Great Pyramid. But I made a video about this about 3 years ago. There seems to be one ancient symbol here near the entrance. This looks identical to the Akhet hieroglyph. The Akhet symbol means the sun setting on the horizon. But when I looked at this for the first time in a few years, there wasn't any figuring out for me. I just read it based on all I know about hieroglyphs. This is the sun setting on the horizon glyph, but when it is displayed in a triangle. It's clear. This is a determinative. It tells you how to take it. This is the sun setting on the horizon of the mountain. Now here's a paper I was reading a few months ago, and this just kind of started to make sense to me. This is about how each face of the pyramid represents a different part of the day. The eastern face here, sunrise obviously. The southern face is all about the day journey of the sun across the sky. But this is about pyramidions that were found in their original position, and you can determine the faces and what each face meant as far as what part of the day or night. And it says here, on the upper register of the western face, the representation of the solar boat is replaced by a large sun disk resting upon the horizon, which represents here more exactly the western mountain of sunset. Everybody's concerned what the Sphinx is facing at sunrise. Well, what's behind them, I think, is truly important. So it seems the builders of the Great Pyramid were trying to tell us that this was the mountain of the sunset in the west. And is there an alignment to the west? Well, the west is called the land of the dead. But the builders of the Great Pyramid, it sure seems to me, were trying to indicate that this was the mountain of the setting sun on the horizon. And this is backed up in the Book of Coming Forth, or the Book of the Dead. It says, "He made the battleship of the gods as Osiris, Lord of the mountain of the west." So it calls Osiris, and of course we have that Osiris shaft in front of the second pyramid, that the symbolic burial of Osiris is said to have taken place. But Osiris, Lord of the mountain of the west. And that seems to be verified by this very glyph here. And here at ancient Rostau, which is Giza, they talk about the mound of Osiris. It says, "I reach the land of the horizon," and that is the west, "and I go into the sacred underworld." So it seems this day that is marked by the alignment of the Sphinx, the east, the rising sun on March 21st, well, the setting sun, that's when the land of the horizon is reached, and that's when they go into the sacred underworld, the land of the dead. But this has been kind of sinking in. We have the gaze of the Sphinx looking at the spring equinox sunrise. Well, dualism is important in Egypt, and the role of the sun going across the sky and equating that to stories on earth. Well, I think we have dualism here. We have the story of the rising sun and of the setting sun going over the two largest pyramids at Giza that are perfectly aligned to the cardinal points. Was one of these actually the monument of Atlantis? Is the land of the west, the land of the dead, actually in alignment to Atlantis? And all the references of the west, of course, the land of the setting sun, the dead, well, relating it to stories on earth, the land of the west is where the sunken island was. Are they being literal? Is the land of the west due west? And the god Thoth, described in the Book of the Dead, the god of the west, and others, the god of the west, everything has to do with the west. Were they being literal? Is the west the land of the dead? Of course, the sun sets in the west. It dies in the west. But is there a story about a place directly west that had to do with death and cataclysm? Now, this is Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And I just find it interesting. Some information in here I kind of don't agree with, but some stuff that really jumped out at me. I was listening to a Randall Carlson lecture on the Great Pyramid, and those are excellent to listen to if you want to really know what was encoded into the Great Pyramid and the knowledge. Randall simply said, the builders of the Great Pyramid had a knowledge of the world, and it's called geodesy, and they encoded it somehow into the Great Pyramid. This knowledge is remarkable, but a knowledge of the earth was encoded into the Great Pyramid. Was the land of the dead the west, literally west? Well, let's just read here. It says, the Egyptians were the only people of antiquity who were well informed as to the history of Atlantis. The Egyptians were never a maritime people, and the Atlanteans must have brought that knowledge to them. They were not likely to send ships to Atlantis. Remember here, this book was written in 1882, I think, and what we know now about the Egyptians, they did do a little sailing, but it says here, we find another proof of the descent of the Egyptians from Atlantis in their belief as to the underworld. This land of the dead was situated in the west. Hence, the tombs were all placed whenever possible on the west bank of the Nile. The constant cry of the mourners as the funeral procession moved forward was, "To the west, to the west." This underworld was beyond the water, hence the funeral procession always crossed a body of water, where the tombs were, as in most cases, on the west bank of the Nile. In this procession was a sacred ark of the sun. All this is very plain. The underworld in the west, the land of the dead, was Atlantis. The drowned world, the world beneath the horizon, beneath the sea, it was only to be reached from Egypt by crossing the water, and it was associated with the ark, the emblem of Atlantis in all lands. The soul of the dead man was supposed to journey to the underworld by a water progress. His destination was the Elysian fields, where mighty corn grew and where he expected to cultivate the earth. This task was of supreme importance. The Elysian fields were the Elysian of the Greeks, the abode of the blessed, which have been seen as an island in the remote west. The Egyptian belief referred to a real country. They described its cities, mountains, and rivers, one of the latter called Uranes, a name which reminds us of the Atlantean god Uranus. In connection with all this, we must not forget that Plato described Atlantis as that sacred island lying beneath the sun. It was based on a universal tradition that under an immense ocean in the far west there was an underworld, a world comprising millions of the dead, a mighty race that had been suddenly swallowed up in the greatest catastrophe known to man since he inhabited the globe. But one thing we do know about the builders of the Great Pyramids, they were very accurate and very, very precise. Was the land of the dead literally west, due west? Well, here is the longitude marking, 295837.92. Here is the line. Well, let's go straight west. Now, I mentioned this in a Q&A video that of all the possibilities, this one seemed to be the best one. But if we go straight west from the Great Pyramids of Giza, and I mean straight west, we land on this island right here. But here is that line coming across from the Great Pyramids, and it runs into this island here. This is called the Seward Seamounts, right next to what they call is the Plato Seamount. But this looks just like Kircher's map of Atlantis. He is the father of Egyptology. Here is Kircher's map of Atlantis out in the middle of the Atlantic, where other cultures definitely say it was, and Plato clearly tells it was. Now here is Kircher's map of Atlantis, out in the middle of the Atlantic, clearly where Plato says it was, and other cultures hint that it was. For sure, these people came from the sea. But if you break this down, this looks just like the Seward Seamount. Now, as a lot of you know, you can measure the Earth in miles and also degrees. Now I put a marker right down here at Giza, and we're going to follow it across to that island. And here, I place the other end of the marker on the island. It's about 3,529 miles where I put the final marker here. This is what's really interesting. We know the Great Pyramid has encoded into it knowledge, mathematical knowledge. How far in degrees is this? Well, it's 51 degrees. And of course, the slope angle of the Great Pyramid is 51 degrees. And there's just a little discrepancy of exactly how much, but here, pinpointed to the island, 51 degrees, angle of the Great Pyramid, 51 plus degrees. Is that a coincidence? Are they marking Atlantis for us? Well, but here is the Sphinx, gazing east, important. What's behind him directly to the west seems to be also important. But here is the middle pyramid, shaped just like the Great Pyramid right next to it. Did this encode a literal meaning of the land of the dead in the west, it is straight west. Well, that island seems to fit, and seems to fit in a mathematical formula. And of course, I know a lot of you have heard of Karl Monk, so I just find this all very interesting. But I feel a little funny saying, hey, this might be Atlantis when we don't even know Atlantis existed. It's a big what if, but it's the best what if I can give you. Hope you thought this was interesting, and you all have a very nice day.